54 Mother Bear carried injured baby. 50 miles through dense forest. What she did put. Everyone in tears. The forest was old, and it felt that way. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sweet, sharp scent of pine. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground, filtering through a high, dense canopy of leaves in soft, shifting patterns. For Ethan Marshall, this was perfect. He had come here to escape noise, not just the sound of city traffic and endless chatter, but the noise inside his own head. With his camera bag slung over his shoulder, he walked slowly, his boots making almost no sound on the mossy ground. He was a photographer, but today he wasn't hunting for the perfect shot. He was just listening to the quiet. The weight of his equipment felt familiar against his back, a constant companion through years of wandering these ancient paths. Each step took him deeper into a world that existed long before humans learned to speak, a world that would continue long after the last word was spoken. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, making the leaves whisper secrets to one another. A distant woodpecker tapped out a steady, rhythmic beat. These were the sounds he wanted, the ones that made the world feel simple and right. He found a fallen log, worn smooth by years of rain and snow, and sat down. The wood was cool beneath him, polished by countless seasons of weather and time. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, letting the peace of the woods wash over him. The air tasted clean, almost sweet, carrying hints of wild berries and the faint musk of deer that had passed through earlier. He could stay here for hours, just being a small, quiet part of this enormous living place. For a long time, the only things that moved were the leaves and the light. Time seemed to slow down in places like this, each moment stretching out like honey dripping from a spoon. His breathing matched the rhythm of the forest, slow and steady, as if he and the woods were breathing together. Then he heard it. It was faint, so faint that at first he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears. But he heard it again. It was a soft, high-pitched sound, like a cry. It wasn't the call of a bird he recognized, nor the sound of any common forest animal. There was a thin thread of sadness in it, a note of distress that felt out of place in the otherwise peaceful woods. The sound seemed to float on the air, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. He opened his eyes and sat perfectly still, listening. Every sense sharpened, his body becoming a receiver for the smallest vibrations in the air. The sound was gone. He waited. The woodpecker continued its work. The leaves kept whispering. Maybe he had imagined it. Years in the wilderness had taught him that the forest could play tricks on the mind, creating phantom sounds from the combination of wind and imagination. He was about to dismiss it when the sound came again, a little, clearer this time, carried on the breeze. It was definitely a cry, weak and lonely. The quality of it was unlike anything he had heard before in all his years of forest wandering. It carried a weight of emotion that seemed almost human in its desperation. A feeling of curiosity began to stir within him, gently pushing aside his desire for complete solitude. He had spent years in the wilderness, and his instincts were sharp. This sound was different. It pulled at him, not with alarm, but with a quiet insistence. Something, somewhere, was asking for help. The photographer in him recognized a moment unfolding, a story beginning to write itself in the language of the wild. He stood up, his peaceful rest forgotten. The log, where he had been sitting already, seemed to belong to another time, another version of himself who hadn't yet heard that haunting cry. He looked in the direction the sound had come from, a part of the forest that was thicker and less traveled. The undergrowth there was denser, the shadows deeper, promising both mystery and perhaps danger. He decided to walk toward it. Each step was deliberate, calculated. He moved with the practiced silence of someone who respected the wild, someone who understood that in the forest he was the visitor. His feet found the soft spots between twigs, avoided the dry leaves that would crackle and announce his presence. He stepped over roots and around thorny bushes, his eyes scanning the woods ahead. The forest seemed to change as he went deeper. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead, making the light even dimmer. It was like walking from day into twilight, from the familiar into the unknown. The air grew cooler, carrying different scents now, earthier, more primal. Moss hung from branches like nature's curtains, and the ground became softer, almost spongy beneath his boots. For a while, he heard nothing but his own soft footsteps. The silence here was different from the peaceful quiet of his resting spot. This silence had weight, had presence. It pressed against his eardrums like water pressure at depth. He started to wonder if he was on a fool's errand, chasing a sound that was no longer there, following a ghost through the trees. He stopped and listened again, holding his breath. His heartbeat seemed impossibly loud in his ears. Silence. A deep, profound silence that seemed to swallow all sound. He felt a small pang of disappointment mixed with relief. The mystery, it seemed, was over before it had even begun. Part of him wanted to return to his simple afternoon of peaceful observation, to the uncomplicated pleasure of just being in nature without any mission or purpose. He turned, ready to head back to his quiet spot, when the cry returned. This time it was closer, much closer. The sound seemed to pierce through the silence like an arrow. There was no mistaking it now. It was a sound of pure sorrow, raw and unfiltered. It was not loud or demanding, but it had a power that went straight to his heart, bypassing all rational thought. It was the kind of sound that spoke to something ancient in human DNA, something that recognized distress across all species barriers. All thoughts of turning back vanished like morning mist. He had to know what it was. He felt a connection to that distant, lonely voice, a sense of shared existence in this vast wilderness. The sound reminded him why he had become a photographer in the first place, to capture and share these moments of raw truth that most people would never witness. He thought about the people who would eventually see his photographs, people in their homes all over the world, sitting in comfortable chairs, looking at screens, transported for a moment into this wild place. It made him wonder about all the other unseen stories unfolding in quiet places, all the dramas playing out beyond human observation. If you're following along on this journey, it's amazing to think about where you might be watching from, sharing in this moment of discovery from your own corner of the world. Every person who appreciates these small, quiet mysteries helps keep the wonder alive, helps preserve these wild spaces by caring about what happens in them. The thought gave him a sense of purpose, a feeling that whatever he was about to witness needed to be seen, needed to be shared. Ethan checked his camera, making sure it was ready. His fingers moved over the familiar controls with practiced ease. Not for a trophy shot, but to document, to remember, to bear witness. This felt important in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The camera had always been his tool for translating the language of the wild into something others could understand. He adjusted the settings for the low light, checked the battery level, made sure he had enough memory cards. These small practical actions grounded him, reminded him that he was here to observe, not to interfere. He moved forward again, more cautiously now. Each step was placed with even greater care. The sound was a guide, appearing and disappearing as the wind shifted, like a beacon calling him deeper into the forest's heart. It led him further away from the familiar paths, away from the trails worn by other hikers, into a part of the woods that felt truly wild, untouched by human presence. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and gnarled, their roots creating a landscape of natural steps and barriers. He could feel a change in the atmosphere. The gentle peace was still there, but now it was layered with a sense of anticipation, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air becomes electric with possibility. He was an observer, about to witness something that was not meant for human eyes, something that belonged entirely to the secret life of the forest. He climbed a small rise, the ground soft with a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled his steps completely. His breathing was controlled, measured, as he ascended. The slope was gentle, but steady, and he used the trees for support, his hands touching bark that had been growing for perhaps 100 years or more. From the top, he could see down into a small, secluded clearing. The trees opened up just enough to let a single, bright column of sunlight shine down, like a spotlight on a stage set by nature herself. The beam of light was so perfect, so theatrical, that it seemed almost supernatural, as if the forest itself was directing his attention to this exact spot. Dust motes danced in the light, tiny specks of life floating in the golden glow. The sound was coming from that clearing. It was much clearer now, no longer muffled by distance and trees. It was a soft, pleading whimper that spoke of pain and fear and need. The quality of the sound had changed now that he was closer. He could hear the exhaustion in it, the weakening of hope. Ethan's heart beat a little faster. His photographer's instinct told him he was about to witness something extraordinary, but his human instinct warned him to be careful. He crouched down behind a thicket of ferns, their fronds creating a perfect natural blind. His body folded into the landscape, becoming part of the forest floor. His curiosity mixed with a healthy dose of caution. He was a guest here, uninvited and possibly unwelcome, and he knew he had to be respectful of whatever drama was unfolding in that sunlit clearing. He slowly parted the ferns with one hand, creating a small opening to look through. The movement was so gradual that the ferns barely rustled. His fingers were gentle, treating the plants with the same care he would use to handle delicate camera equipment. The light in the clearing was bright, almost blinding after the dimness of the deep forest, and for a moment his eyes had to adjust. Colors seemed more vivid here, the greens more green, the browns richer and deeper. He blinked, waiting for his vision to clear. He saw movement, a large dark shape that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was big, much bigger than a deer or a wolf, much bigger than anything that should be moving with such stillness. His breath caught in his throat. The shape was massive, taking up a significant portion of the clearing. His hand, the one holding the camera, froze. Years of training told him not to make any sudden movements. He saw a massive form, covered in thick brown fur that seemed to ripple with each breath the creature took. The fur was not uniform in color, ranging from deep chocolate brown to lighter, almost golden patches where the sun hit it directly. It was a bear, unmistakably a bear, but larger than any he had ever seen this close. But something was wrong. Its posture, the way it held its massive head, was not threatening. There was no aggression in its stance, no territorial display. Instead, it was slumped, heavy with a sorrow that Ethan could feel even from a distance, a sorrow that seemed to radiate from the creature like heat from a fire. The scene, before him, was not one of wild aggression or natural hunting behavior, but of quiet, heartbreaking despair. The bear's shoulders were hunched, its head low, and it swayed slightly, as if the weight of its grief was too much to bear. And the crying sound was coming from right beside it, from something small and hidden by the bear's massive bulk. Through the narrow gap in the ferns, Ethan watched, completely still, barely breathing. His body had become like stone, every muscle locked in place. The bear was enormous, a creature of immense power, probably weighing 500 or 600 pounds. Its presence dominated the clearing completely. He had seen bears before, but always from a much greater distance, through telephoto lenses, or in moments of swift, purposeful action as they moved through their territory. This was different, intimate in a way that felt almost intrusive. This bear was not moving with purpose. It stood over something on the ground, its huge shoulders slumped in a posture that was unmistakably one of defeat. Its head was low, almost touching the ground, and it let out a low, rumbling groan, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground Ethan was kneeling on. The sound traveled through the earth and up into his bones, a frequency of pure grief that needed no translation. It was a sound of deep, profound sorrow, the kind that transcends species and speaks directly to the heart. The groan went on, rising and falling like a lament, like a mother's cry for her child. His eyes adjusted further to the light, and he saw what the bear was guarding so intently. At its feet lay a small, fragile shape that looked impossibly tiny next to the massive adult. A cube. It was tiny, barely larger than a house cat, its fur a lighter shade of brown than its mother's, still fluffy with youth. The contrast between the enormous mother and the tiny cub was striking, emphasizing both the power of the adult and the vulnerability of the young. It was the cub that was making the faint crying sound he had been following. The little creature was on its side, and one of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle that made Ethan wince. The leg was clearly broken, twisted in a way that meant the cub could not walk, could not follow its mother, could not survive on its own. A small patch of its fur was dark and matted, suggesting blood, though from this distance he couldn't be sure. The cub's tiny chest rose and fell rapidly, its breathing labored and painful. It was injured, badly injured, and in the harsh reality of the wild, this usually meant only one thing. The cub whimpered again, a weak, pathetic sound that was barely audible even in the silence of the clearing, and the mother bear responded with another low groan. The exchange was like a conversation, the child calling for help, the mother responding with her own anguish at being unable to provide it. She lowered her massive head and gently nudged her baby with her nose, a gesture so tender and full of concern that it took Ethan's breath away. The touch was so light, so careful, as if she was afraid of causing more pain. The contrast between her enormous size and the delicacy of her touch was profound. In that single moment, all of Ethan's fear vanished like smoke. It was replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it felt like a physical force pressing against his chest. His eyes began to water, though he couldn't say if it was from the emotion or from staring so intently without blinking. He was no longer looking at a dangerous predator, something to be feared and avoided. He was looking at a mother, simply a mother, experiencing the most primal and universal of emotions. A mother watching her child suffer, helpless and desperate, caught in that terrible space between love and powerlessness. The scene was utterly silent except for the cub's soft cries and the mother's sorrowful groans. Even the forest seemed to have gone quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath, respecting this moment of grief. It was a private moment of sorrow, and he felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred, but he couldn't look away. The scene held him transfixed, rooted to his spot behind the ferns. He slowly raised his camera, the lens feeling heavy in his hands, weighted with the responsibility of what he was about to capture. His fingers found the controls by muscle memory alone, his eyes never leaving the bears. He needed to capture this, not for the thrill of getting a rare shot, not for any prize or recognition, but for the truth of it. The truth that love and pain were not just human feelings, that the bonds between parent and child existed throughout nature, just as powerful, just as devastating when threatened. He watched for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. Time seemed to move differently in the presence of such raw emotion. The mother bear did not leave her cub's side, not for a moment. She paced a tight circle around it, her movements agitated and full of a nervous energy that seemed barely contained. Her massive paws, each the size of dinner plates, stepped carefully around the small body, never coming too close, as if she was afraid of accidentally hurting her baby further. She would stop every few seconds, nudge the cub again with infinite gentleness, and then look up at the surrounding forest, her nose twitching, as if searching for an answer in the trees. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, scanned the forest line with a desperation that was painful to witness. She seemed confused, lost, overwhelmed by a situation that had no solution in her world. What could she do? In the wild, there were no hospitals, no veterinarians, no second chances. A cub with a broken leg could not travel, could not forage, could not escape danger. It could not climb trees to escape predators, could not keep up with its mother as she searched for food. In the harsh reality of the wilderness, this was a death sentence, and Mother Bear seemed to understand this on some deep, instinctual level. Ethan's heart ached for them. The emotion was so strong it was almost physical, a tightness in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He was a wildlife photographer. He had been doing this for over 15 years. He knew the rules, had them drilled into him from his first day in the field. The first rule was to never interfere. Nature had its own course, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Death was as much a part of the forest as life. Predators needed to eat. The weak and injured became food for others. It was the cycle that kept everything in balance. But watching this display of raw, maternal love, the rules felt cold and distant, created by people who had never witnessed something like this. He was witnessing a story, not just a biological event. A story of a mother who refused to give up, even when all hope seemed lost. The bear's devotion to her cub was absolute, unwavering, and it stirred something deep in Ethan's own memories of his mother, who had passed away just 2 years ago. He remembered her by his hospital bed after his motorcycle accident. That same desperate look in her eyes, that same helpless pacing. Then the bear did something that made Ethan's jaw drop. After one last long look at her whimpering cub, she seemed to make a decision. The change was sudden and dramatic. Her entire posture transformed in an instant. The slumped shoulders straightened, pulling her up to her full, impressive height. The look of confusion and despair in her eyes was replaced by one of fierce, unshakable determination. It was as if she had been arguing with herself, weighing options, and had finally come to a resolution. She knelt down, her powerful front legs bending in a movement that seemed almost human in its deliberateness. Her body lowered slowly, carefully, until she was almost lying on the ground. With an incredible gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of her size and strength, she used her snout and one massive paw to carefully shift the cub. The movements were so precise, so calculated, that it was clear she understood exactly how fragile her baby was. The cub cried out in a short burst of pain as it was moved, a sharp yelp that cut through the air like a knife, and the mother bear froze instantly, every muscle in her body going rigid. She let out a soft, reassuring rumble, a sound that was almost like a purr, clearly meant to comfort. She waited a moment, her head close to her baby, making soft sounds that Ethan had never heard a bear make before, sounds that seemed designed purely for comfort and reassurance. Then, when the cub had quieted, she continued her work. Slowly, Carefully, with a patience that seemed infinite, she maneuvered her cub until she could slide her front legs underneath it. The process took several minutes, with many pauses to ensure she wasn't causing additional pain. She adjusted and readjusted, finding the perfect position that would support the cub without putting pressure on its injured leg. Then, with a mighty heave that showcased the incredible strength hidden in her frame, she rose to her hind legs. The movement was fluid despite its power, a controlled display of raw strength. For a moment, she stood there, a towering figure against the forest light, 7 feet tall at least, holding her tiny, injured baby cradled against her chest, much like a human mother would hold her child. The sight was so unexpected, so impossibly tender, that Ethan felt tears running down his face. He wasn't ashamed of them. This was beyond anything he had ever witnessed in nature. The bear stood on her hind legs, her front legs wrapped around her cub, holding it secure against her chest. The cub's head rested against her fur, and she had positioned it so its injured leg hung free, not pressed against anything. Ethan's hands trembled as he pressed the shutter button on his camera. Click. The sound was barely audible, no louder than a snapping twig, but in the quiet clearing it felt like a shout. The bear's head snapped up immediately, her ears perked forward, every sense suddenly alert. She looked directly towards the thicket where Ethan was hiding, her gaze penetrating and intense. His blood ran cold, every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew that would be the worst thing he could do. He had been discovered. Running would trigger her chase instinct. He held his breath, his body frozen in place, expecting a roar, a charge, expecting those powerful legs to propel her toward him with terrifying speed. His mind raced through his options, all of them bad, but the bear did not move toward him. She just stared, her dark, intelligent eyes seeming to look right through the ferns and into his soul. The moment stretched out, feeling like hours. There was no anger in her gaze, no territorial aggression, only a deep, weary sadness, and perhaps, though he might have been imagining it, a silent plea. Her eyes were so expressive, so full of emotion that they seemed almost human. They stayed like that for a long, frozen moment, the human and the bear, locked in a silent understanding that transcended species. He was not a threat, and somehow, impossibly, she knew it. She was a mother on a mission, and he was just a witness, perhaps even a witness she wanted, someone to know her story. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear broke the gaze. She gave a small huff, a sound of resignation or perhaps dismissal, and turned. The movement was slow, deliberate. Holding her cub securely against her chest, she began to walk. She did not run, did not flee from the human presence. She moved with a slow, deliberate, rolling gait, her powerful legs carrying the extra weight with a steadiness that was astonishing. Each step was measured, careful, designed to minimize the jostling of her precious cargo. She was not heading deeper into the forest, which would have been the expected direction, nor was she heading back the way she had come. She was walking with a purpose, on a path that only she knew, heading towards something specific. Her direction was deliberate, chosen, not random. She moved through the clearing and into the trees on the far side, her large form disappearing and reappearing between the trunks as she walked. Ethan watched until she disappeared completely between the trees, a solitary figure of strength and sorrow, carrying her broken child into the unknown. The clearing felt empty and silent without her, as if her presence had been holding it together. The spotlight of sun had moved on, now illuminating empty ground where moments before a drama of life and death had played out. The ferns around him rustled in a breeze he hadn't noticed before. He slowly stood up, his legs stiff and tingling from crouching for so long. His knees cracked as he straightened, reminding him of how long he had been frozen in place. He looked down at his camera, at the image he had just captured on the small preview screen. The mother bear, standing tall, holding her child, backlit by the forest light. It was the most powerful photograph he had ever taken, he was sure of it. The composition was perfect, but more than that, it captured something true, something that spoke to the universal nature of love and sacrifice. But the story wasn't over. It had just begun. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to follow her. He had to see where she was going, had to know how this story ended. He checked his supplies quickly, mental inventory of water, food, batteries, memory cards. He had enough for maybe a day in the forest. He shouldered his bag, feeling its familiar weight settle onto his back, and stepped out from behind the ferns, setting his feet on the path the bear had taken. The ground showed clear signs of her passage: bent grass, compressed earth, the occasional perfect paw print in soft soil. He was ready to witness the rest of her impossible journey, whatever that might be. The forest seemed different now as he followed the bear's trail. Every shadow might hide her massive form, every sound might be her movement through the undergrowth. But there was no fear in him now, only a deep curiosity and a growing respect for the creature he was following. The trail was not hard to follow. A bear carrying a cub, walking upright for stretches, left clear signs. Broken twigs at shoulder height where a four-legged animal would never break them. Deep impressions in soft ground from the concentrated weight. The occasional tuft of fur caught on a branch. But what struck Ethan most was the deliberateness of the path. This was not random wandering. The bear was following something, maybe an old game trail, maybe a path worn by generations of her kind, maybe something else entirely. The direction was consistent, purposeful. She knew where she was going. As he walked, Ethan thought about what he was witnessing. In all his years, photographing wildlife, he had seen many things that had challenged his understanding of animal behavior. He had seen elephants appear to mourn their dead, standing vigil over fallen family members. He had seen dolphins supporting injured pod members, keeping them at the surface to breathe. But this was different. This was a bear, a solitary creature by nature, displaying a level of problem-solving and determination that seemed almost impossible. The typical response to an injured cub would be abandonment. It was harsh but necessary for survival. A mother bear with other cubs might leave an injured one to save the healthy ones. A mother with only one injured cub would typically stay with it until it died, then move on. But this bear was doing neither. She was attempting something else, something that required planning, determination, and hope. The very concept of hope in an animal was something scientists debated endlessly. But watching this bear, Ethan had no doubt. She hoped. She hoped there was something at the end of this journey that could save her child. The path led steadily in one direction, not quite straight but consistent in its general heading. They were moving parallel to the mountain slope, neither climbing nor descending significantly. The forest began to change subtly as they traveled. The trees were still old and tall, but there were signs of past human presence. An old blaze mark on a tree, so weathered it was barely visible. A piece of wire embedded in bark, grown over by decades of growth. They were moving toward the edge of the true wilderness, toward the boundary where the wild met the civilized. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. Where could she be going? Bears avoided human settlements as a rule, teaching their cubs from an early age to fear the smell of humans and dogs. But this bear was walking steadily toward areas where human presence would be more likely. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, sending long shadows through the forest. The light turned golden, then orange. Ethan had been following for over 2 hours now, maintaining a respectful distance, close enough to keep the trail, but far enough that he hoped she wouldn't feel pursued. Occasionally, he would catch a glimpse of her through the trees, still walking, still carrying her burden. She had not put the cub down once. The strength required for this was enormous. A mother bear might typically weigh 400 pounds. Her cub, even small, probably weighed 30 or 40 pounds. To carry that weight for hours, over rough terrain, while walking partially upright, was a feat of endurance that spoke to desperation and determination in equal measure. As the day grew later, Ethan began to notice something else. They were not alone in the forest. Other animals were watching this strange procession. He saw deer in the distance, standing alert, watching the bear pass. They didn't flee, as they normally would from a predator. They seemed to sense that this bear was not hunting, was focused on something else entirely. A fox appeared briefly, trotting parallel to their path for a few minutes before disappearing into the underbrush. Even the birds seemed interested, following from tree to tree, their usual songs replaced by curious chirps and calls. It was as if the entire forest recognized that something unusual was happening, something worth watching. The bear seemed oblivious to all of it, focused entirely on her journey and her cub. Every so often, Ethan would hear her make soft sounds to the cub, those same comforting rumbles and huffs. The cub had stopped crying constantly, only occasionally letting out a weak whimper. Whether this was from exhaustion or comfort, Ethan couldn't tell. As they continued, the signs of human presence became more obvious. The trees were younger in places, evidence of logging from decades past. There were more trails, some obviously made by humans rather than animals. The bear navigated these with surprising knowledge, choosing paths that kept them in cover while still moving steadily in her chosen direction. She was being careful, cautious, but not deterred. Whatever her destination, the risk of human encounter was not enough to stop her. Ethan began to hear something in the distance. It was faint at first, just a low hum that could have been wind or water. But as they continued, it became clearer. It was the sound of a road. Not a major highway, but a road nonetheless. Cars passing occasionally, the distant sound of engines. His heart rate increased. A bear approaching a road with an injured cub was dangerous for everyone involved. Cars wouldn't expect a bear, especially not one walking upright carrying a cub. The bear might panic at the traffic. This could end badly in so many ways. But the bear didn't hesitate. If anything, she seemed to move with more purpose as the sound of the road grew closer. She adjusted her hold on the cub, securing it more tightly against her chest. Her head was up, ears forward, every sense alert. She knew the road was there. She knew what it meant. And still, she walked toward it. Ethan quickened his pace slightly, wanting to be closer when they reached the road, though he had no idea what he could do to help. The trees began to thin. Through them, he could see the glint of metal and glass. The road. It was a 2-lane mountain road, the kind that wound through the forest connecting small towns and isolated homes. Not busy, but not abandoned either. The bear stopped at the tree line, still hidden in shadow. She stood there for a long moment watching, listening, waiting. A car passed, then another. She waited. The road fell quiet. No engine sounds, no approaching vehicles. She took a deep breath, visible in the rise and fall of her massive chest, and stepped out of the forest. The sight of the enormous bear, standing upright, carrying a cub, walking beside a mountain road in the dying light of day, was surreal. Ethan quickly moved to a position where he could see but remained hidden. He raised his camera, knowing this image would be important. The bear walked along the shoulder of the road, not on the pavement but just beside it, in the gravel and grass. She moved quickly now, not running, but walking with long, purposeful strides. She was exposed here, vulnerable, and she knew it. Her head turned constantly, checking both directions for approaching vehicles. The cub was quiet against her chest, either asleep or in shock. The bear's breathing was labored now, the hours of carrying her baby finally showing in the heave of her sides, the slight stumble in her gait. But she didn't stop, didn't rest. She had a destination, and she was close. Ethan could feel it in the urgency of her movements. Then he saw it. Ahead, maybe a quarter-mile down the road, was a small building set back from the road. It was modest, single-story, with a gravel parking area in front. But what made Ethan's breath catch was the sign. Even from this distance, he could make out the universal symbol of veterinary medicine, the staff with the snake. It was a veterinary clinic, a small, rural veterinary clinic. The bear was walking toward a veterinary clinic. The impossibility of it hit Ethan like a physical blow. How could she know? How could she possibly know what that building was? But there was no denying her destination. She was walking directly toward it, had been walking toward it for hours through the forest. This was her goal, her impossible, incredible goal. She was bringing her injured cub to the one place that might be able to help, the one place in her territory where injured animals were healed. As they got closer, Ethan could see more details. The clinic was closed, no cars in the parking lot, no lights on inside except for a small security light. It was late, past business hours. But there was a house attached to the back of the clinic and lights were on in those windows. Someone was home. The veterinarian lived on site, as was common in rural areas. The bear reached the edge of the parking lot and stopped. She stood there, at the boundary between wild and civilized, holding her cub. She seemed uncertain now, the determination that had carried her this far wavering in the face of this final barrier. The building smelled of humans, of dogs and cats, of medicine and chemicals. Every instinct she had would be screaming at her to flee. But her cub was dying, and somehow, some way, she knew that inside that building was the only hope. She took a step into the parking lot, then another. Her movements were slow now, cautious. She walked to the front door of the clinic and stopped. Through the glass door, Ethan could see the dark waiting room, chairs, and a reception desk barely visible in the dim light. The bear stood there, looking through the glass, her reflection staring back at her. Then she did something that made Ethan's eyes fill with tears again. She sat down. Right there, in front of the door, she carefully sat down on her haunches, still holding her cub. And she waited. She didn't pound on the door, didn't roar or make noise. She just sat, patient and quiet, waiting for someone to notice her. Waiting for help. It was the most human gesture he had ever seen from a wild animal, and also the most heartbreaking. She understood, on some level, that this was a place of healing. She understood that the humans inside could help, and she was willing to trust them with her most precious thing. Her baby. Ethan watched from the tree line, his camera forgotten in his hands. He was witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about animal intelligence, about the boundaries between wild and domestic, about the capacity for trust across species. The bear sat there, occasionally adjusting her hold on the cub, occasionally looking through the glass door, but mostly just waiting. The cub stirred against her chest, letting out a weak cry, and she rumbled softly to it, a sound of comfort and reassurance. Time passed. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The bear didn't move. Her patience was infinite, her hope unwavering. Then a light came on inside the clinic. A figure appeared in the hallway beyond the waiting room. A woman, middle-aged, wearing casual clothes. She was probably coming to check something, or maybe she had heard something. She walked into the waiting room, flipping on lights as she went. She reached for something on the reception desk, then froze. Through the glass door, she found herself looking directly into the eyes of a massive bear. For a moment, neither moved. The woman stood frozen, her hand still extended toward whatever she had been reaching for. The bear sat perfectly still, holding her cub, looking back at the woman through the glass. It was a moment of perfect suspension, two species regarding each other across an impossible divide. Then the woman's eyes dropped to the cub in the bear's arms. Even from where Ethan watched, he could see the change in her expression. The fear didn't leave entirely, but it was joined by something else: understanding. She was a veterinarian. She had dedicated her life to helping animals. And here was an animal, a wild animal, asking for help in the only way it knew how. The woman moved slowly, carefully. She held up one hand in what was clearly meant to be a calming gesture, though whether for the bear or herself was unclear. With her other hand, she reached for her phone. She made a quick call, speaking urgently but quietly. Then she approached the door. The bear watched her come, not moving, barely breathing. The woman reached the door and stopped, her hand on the handle. They looked at each other again through the glass, a long, measuring look. The woman was clearly terrified, her hand shaking on the door handle. But she was also a healer, and there was an injured animal that needed help. Slowly, so slowly, she turned the handle and opened the door, not all the way, just a crack, enough to speak through. Her voice was soft, trembling but determined. "Hey there, Mama. I see your baby is hurt. You brought your baby here for help?" The bear didn't move, didn't react to the voice except to blink slowly. The woman opened the door a little wider. "I'm Dr. Sarah. I help animals. I can help your baby if you'll let me." Still, the bear didn't move, just sat there holding her cub, looking at this human who was offering exactly what she had traveled so far to find. Dr. Sarah opened the door fully and stepped back, an invitation. The bear looked at the open doorway, then back at the woman. Then, with infinite care, she stood up. She had to duck to fit through the doorway, her bulk barely fitting through the opening designed for humans and domestic animals. But she managed it, stepping into the veterinary clinic with her injured cub. The fluorescent lights were bright after the darkness outside, illuminating the scene in harsh detail. The bear's fur was matted with sweat and dirt from her long journey. The cub looked even smaller and more fragile in the artificial light, its injured leg clearly broken, swollen, and discolored. Dr. Sarah backed up slowly, giving the bear space, but not retreating entirely. "The examination room is this way," she said, her voice steadier now, falling into her professional rhythm. She gestured to a doorway leading deeper into the clinic. "It's bigger. More room for you both." The bear followed. It was surreal, watching this massive wild animal walking through a veterinary clinic, past posters about heartworm prevention and spay-neuter benefits, past the scale for weighing dogs, past the rack of leashes and collars for sale. She followed the veterinarian into the examination room, a larger space with a metal table in the center and cabinets full of medical supplies. Dr. Sarah didn't try to take the cub from the bear. Instead, she gestured to the floor beside the examination table. "You can put your baby down here." "I need to look at the leg." The bear understood, or seemed to. She carefully lowered herself to the floor, and for the first time in hours, gently placed her cub on the floor. The cub whimpered at the movement, and the mother bear immediately nuzzled it with her nose, making those soft, comforting sounds. Dr. Sarah knelt down a few feet away, moving slowly, telegraphing every movement. "I'm just going to look, okay?" "Just look first." She examined the cub visually first, not touching, assessing the injury from a distance. The bear watched every movement, her body tense, ready to intervene if this human proved to be a threat. But she didn't interfere, didn't growl or show aggression. She had made her choice to trust, and she was seeing it through. "After a few moments, doctor." Sarah looked up at the bear. "The leg is broken, but I can fix it. I can help, but I need to touch your baby, need to give medicine for the pain. Is that okay?" She was talking to the bear as if it could understand every word, and maybe it could understand the tone if not the words. The bear looked at her cub, then back at the veterinarian, and then she did something remarkable. She laid down on the floor beside her cub and placed one massive paw gently on its body, holding it still. It was permission. It was trust. It was a mother doing whatever was necessary to save her child. Dr. Sarah worked quickly but carefully. She prepared a syringe with pain medication, showing it to the bear before approaching the cub. "This will help with the pain," she said softly. The injection was quick, and within minutes the cub's whimpering quieted as the medication took effect. The bear watched everything, her eyes never leaving her baby. Dr. Sarah then began a more thorough examination, gently manipulating the broken leg, checking for other injuries. She spoke continuously, her voice soft and reassuring, explaining everything she was doing. Whether for the bear's benefit or her own calm, it seemed to help. Another car pulled up outside, and a young man rushed in, obviously the assistant doctor. Sarah had called. He stopped dead in the doorway of the examination room, his eyes wide at the scene before him. "Doc, is that a wild bear?" Dr. Sarah didn't look up from her work. "Yes, Tom, and she brought us her injured cub. We're going to help them. Get the portable X-ray machine, please, and move slowly, no sudden movements." Tom, to his credit, recovered quickly. He had worked with Dr. Sarah for 3 years and had seen her handle all sorts of difficult situations, but this was beyond anything either of them had experienced. He retrieved the X-ray equipment, setting it up with careful, deliberate movements. The bear watched him, but didn't react aggressively. She seemed to understand that these humans were helping. The X-rays confirmed what Dr. Sarah had suspected: a clean break of the tibia, painful but fixable. "We need to set the bone and cast it," she told the bear, as if explaining to any concerned parent. "Your baby will need to be very still for a while. I'm going to give a little more medicine to make sure there's no pain." The bear remained where she was, that one paw still resting on her cub, her presence both protective and permissive. What followed was one of the most extraordinary medical procedures either veterinarian had ever performed. They set the broken bone, with the mother bear watching every movement. They cleaned and dressed the wounds. They applied a cast, specially modified to work for a bear cub's anatomy. Through it all, the mother bear stayed calm, present, trusting. Occasionally, when the cub would stir or make a sound, she would lean down and nuzzle it, making those soft, rumbling sounds of comfort. The procedure took nearly 2 hours. By the end, the cub was sleeping peacefully, its leg properly set and cast, pain medication ensuring its comfort. Dr. Sarah sat back on her heels, exhausted but exhilarated. She had just performed veterinary medicine on a wild bear cub while its mother watched. It was impossible, and yet it had happened. "The cast needs to stay on for 6 weeks," she told the mother bear. "Your baby can't walk on it during that time. But bears heal quickly. Your baby will be okay." The bear looked at her cub, now sleeping peacefully, its tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Then she looked at Dr. Sarah. What passed between them in that moment was beyond words, beyond species. It was recognition, gratitude, and something deeper. An acknowledgement of shared purpose, of the universal drive to protect and heal the young. The bear, then, carefully picked up her cub, now heavier with the cast but no longer crying in pain. She stood up, filling the examination room with her presence. Dr. Sarah and Tom backed away, giving her clear passage to the door. But the bear didn't leave immediately. She stood there for a moment, looking at the two humans who had helped her child. Then she made a sound, not a growl or a roar, but something softer, almost like a sigh. A thank you, perhaps, in the only way she could express it. She walked back through the clinic, ducking through doorways, careful not to knock anything over with her bulk. Dr. Sarah followed at a distance, opening the front door for her. The bear stepped out into the night, her cub held securely against her chest. But instead of immediately disappearing into the forest, she turned back one more time. In the light spilling from the clinic doorway, she stood there, looking back at the humans who had helped her. Ethan, still watching from the trees, captured this moment with his camera. The image would later become one of the most shared wildlife photographs in history, showing the bear, standing upright, cradling her casted cub, looking back at the lit doorway of the clinic where two humans stood watching her go. It was a moment that spoke to something fundamental about the possibility of connection across species, about trust, about the universal nature of love, and the lengths to which a mother would go to save her child. The bear turned and walked back toward the forest, moving more slowly now, but with a different quality to her movement. The desperation was gone, replaced by something like peace. She had done it. She had saved her cub. As she reached the tree line, Ethan stepped out from his hiding place. The bear saw him, recognized him as the one who had followed her journey. For a moment, they regarded each other, the photographer and the bear, two witnesses to something extraordinary. Then she disappeared into the darkness of the forest, carrying her healing cub home. Dr. Sarah and Tom stood in the doorway of the clinic for a long time after the bear had gone, trying to process what had just happened. They had been part of something remarkable, something that challenged their understanding of animal intelligence and behavior. The next morning, they would find Ethan at their door, showing them the photographs he had taken, sharing the full story of the bear's incredible journey. The story would spread, not as a tale of human heroism, but as a testament to a mother's love and intelligence that transcended species boundaries. In the weeks that followed, the bear would return. Not to the clinic itself, but to the edge of the forest where it met the clinic property. Dr. Sarah would see her there sometimes in the early morning, checking from a distance. The cub's cast would eventually need to be removed, and somehow everyone knew the bear would bring her baby back when it was time. It became a secret shared by a few, a story too precious to be turned into a spectacle. The bear had trusted them with her most vulnerable moment, and they would honor that trust by protecting her privacy. But for those who knew, who had witnessed or heard the true story, it changed something fundamental about how they saw the world. It suggested that the boundaries between human and animal, between wild and civilized, were not as fixed as they had believed. It suggested that intelligence, emotion, and the capacity for trust existed in forms and places they had never imagined. The weeks that followed the bear's first visit to the clinic became a quiet legend in the small mountain community. Dr. Sarah had told only a few trusted people about what had happened that night, and Ethan had shared his photographs with just a select few, understanding that some stories were too precious to be turned into media spectacles. But nature has its own way of revealing truths, and the bear, it seemed, had her own plans for how this story would continue. Every few days, always in the early morning, when the mist still clung to the valleys and the world was quiet, she would appear at the edge of the forest behind the clinic. She never came close, never entered the building again, but she would stand there, visible from the clinic windows, her cub by her side. The little one was walking now, limping heavily on its casted leg but mobile, alive, thriving against all odds. Dr. Sarah would watch from her office window, coffee cup in hand, marveling at the sight. The cub was growing, its fur becoming thicker and glossier, its movements more confident despite the cast. The mother bear had become an expert at helping her baby navigate with the medical device, using her own body to support the cub when the terrain was difficult, finding paths that were easier for the little one to manage. It was clear that she understood the cast's purpose, that it was helping her baby heal. She protected it carefully, not allowing the cub to get it too wet when they crossed streams, keeping it clean of mud and debris as much as possible in the wild environment. Tom, Dr. Sarah's assistant, had started arriving early just to catch glimpses of them. He would stand beside Doctor. Sarah at the window, both of them silent, watching this impossible partnership between wild and civilized continue to unfold. Ethan had returned to the forest many times since that first incredible night, always careful, always respectful, documenting the bear's journey from a distance. He had watched her teach her cub to forage with its limitation, had seen her carry the little one across a river to keep the cast dry, had observed her fierce protection when other predators came too close. His photographs told a story of adaptation and intelligence that went far beyond what most people believed possible for wild animals. The bear had developed a routine, a pattern that showed remarkable understanding. She would bring her cub to the forest edge every third day, always at dawn, as if showing Dr. Sarah the progress. It was like a follow-up appointment, conducted at a respectful distance, but unmistakably intentional. One morning, exactly 6 weeks after the cast had been applied, the bear did something different. Instead of staying at the forest edge, she began walking toward the clinic. The sun was just rising, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, and the bear moved through this light like something from a dream. Her cub limped beside her, the cast now worn and dirty from weeks in the wilderness, but still intact. Dr. Sarah saw them coming and knew immediately what this meant. 6 weeks. The exact time frame she had mentioned for the cast to stay on. Somehow, the bear had kept track, had known when to return. Dr. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she prepared the clinic, pulling out the tools she would need to remove the cast, setting up the examination room just as it had been that first night. She opened the back door of the clinic, the one that faced the forest, and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The bear stopped about 20 feet away, her cub pressed close to her side. They regarded each other, the woman and the bear, and in that moment, Doctor. Sarah felt the weight of the trust being placed in her. This wild creature was choosing to return, choosing to trust her again with her most precious possession. "Good morning, Mama, Doctor," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying in the still morning air. "I see you've brought your baby back. The cast needs to come off, doesn't it?" You remembered. The bear made a soft huffing sound, not aggressive, almost conversational. She nudged her cub forward gently, encouraging it to move toward the human. The cub looked up at its mother, then took a tentative step forward, then another. Its movement was still hampered by the cast, but there was no fear in its eyes, only curiosity. This was remarkable in itself. A wild bear cub that had never been habituated to humans was approaching one voluntarily, suggesting that its mother had somehow communicated that this human was safe, was helpful. The cub stopped halfway between its mother and Doctor, Sarah looking back and forth between them, waiting for further instruction. Dr. Sarah slowly knelt down, making herself smaller, less threatening. She pulled out a small pair of specialized scissors designed for removing casts. She held them up, showing them to both bears. "These will cut the cast off. It won't hurt, I promise. Your leg is healed now, little one." The mother bear watched intently as Dr. Sarah slowly approached her cub. When she was about 5 feet away, the cub suddenly turned and limped back to its mother, pressing against her leg. But the mother didn't retreat. Instead, she did something extraordinary. She lay down on the ground, her massive body creating a barrier on one side of the cub, and gently guided the little one to lie down as well. It was an invitation, a signal that Dr. Sarah could approach. The veterinarian moved forward on her knees, speaking softly the entire time, explaining what she was doing as if the bears could understand every word. Maybe they could understand the tone, the intent, the careful respect in her voice. She reached the cub and gently touched the cast. The little bear flinched but didn't pull away, its mother's presence giving it confidence. Dr. Sarah worked quickly but carefully, cutting through the cast material with practiced precision. The sound of the scissors working through the plaster seemed loud in the morning quiet, but neither bear moved. As pieces of the cast fell away, the leg beneath was revealed. It was thinner than the other leg from weeks of limited use, but it was straight, healed. The bone had mended perfectly. The last piece of cast fell away, and the cub lifted its leg, looking at it with what seemed like surprise. It flexed its paw, moved its leg experimentally. Then it stood up, wobbling slightly as it adjusted to having full use of the limb again. Dr. Sarah sat back, watching as the cub took its first unencumbered steps in 6 weeks. It was shaky at first, the muscle weak from disuse, but with each step it grew more confident. The mother bear rose to her feet, towering over Dr. Sarah, who remained kneeling on the ground. For a moment, the veterinarian felt a flutter of fear. She was completely vulnerable, within easy reach of one of nature's most powerful predators. But the bear didn't attack. Instead, she did something that would stay with Dr. Sarah for the rest of her life. The massive bear leaned down and gently touched her nose to the top of Dr. Sarah's head, just for a second. It was a gesture so gentle, so deliberate, that its meaning was unmistakable. "Thank you." Then the bear turned to her cub, who was now walking in small circles, testing its healed leg. She made a soft calling sound, and the cub immediately came to her side. Together, they began to walk back toward the forest. But the cub, in the way of all young animals, couldn't resist looking back at the human who had helped it. It stopped, turned, and took a few steps back toward Dr. Sarah. The mother allowed this, watching as her cub approached the veterinarian one more time. The little bear came close enough that Dr. Sarah could have touched it, and for a moment they looked at each other, two different species sharing a moment of connection. Then the cub turned and bounded back to its mother, its gait still slightly uneven but improving with every step. As they reached the forest edge, something remarkable happened. Other animals began to appear. First, a doe stepped out from behind a tree, her fawn beside her. Then a fox emerged from the underbrush. Birds landed on branches overhead. It was as if the forest itself had been watching this story unfold and now wanted to witness its conclusion. The mother bear and her cub paused at the tree line, surrounded by this gathering of forest creatures. It was a scene that defied explanation, a moment that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of nature. Ethan, watching from his hidden position, photographed frantically, knowing he was witnessing something that might never be seen again. The animals weren't interacting with each other, weren't acknowledging each other in any obvious way, but their presence created a kind of silent ceremony, a forced acknowledgement of what had transpired. The mother bear looked back one last time at the clinic, at Doctor. Sarah, still kneeling on the ground, at the building that had been her desperate hope and had become her miracle. Then she and her cub disappeared into the forest, the other animals dispersing as silently as they had appeared. The clearing was empty again, but the air still hummed with the significance of what had just occurred. Dr. Sarah finally stood, her knees stiff from kneeling on the ground. She walked back to the clinic in a daze, trying to process what she had experienced. Inside, Tom was waiting, having watched everything from the window. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. What was there to say? They had been part of something that transcended their understanding of veterinary medicine, of animal behavior, of the boundaries between species. In the days that followed, Ethan finally shared the full story with Doctor, Sarah and Tom, showing them all the photographs he had taken from that first moment in the forest clearing to the final farewell. Together, they decided to document the entire event properly, but to keep it within the scientific community rather than turning it into a media sensation. The bear and her cub deserved their privacy, deserved to live their lives without being hunted by photographers and tourists. But the story needed to be told, needed to be preserved, because it challenged so much of what we thought we knew about animal intelligence and the capacity for interspecies trust. The scientific paper they eventually published would become one of the most discussed documents in wildlife biology, not because it provided answers, but because it raised so many questions. How had the bear known about the veterinary clinic? How had she understood that the humans there could help? How had she kept track of the 6-week time frame for the cast? The theories ranged from learned behavior passed down through generations to some form of animal intelligence that science had yet to fully understand. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed it firsthand, the explanations mattered less than the experience itself. They had been part of a moment when the walls between human and animal had become transparent, when compassion and trust had bridged an impossible gap. Dr. Sarah would see the bears occasionally over the following months, always at a distance. The cub grew strong and healthy, its leg showing no signs of the old injury. It played and climbed trees and did all the things bear cubs should do. The mother remained protective, but no longer carried the desperate edge that had driven her to the clinic that first night. They were wild bears living wild lives, but they carried with them a story that connected them forever to a small group of humans who had chosen to help when help was needed. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, Sarah would find small gifts at the back door of the clinic, a pile of particularly beautiful pine cones arranged almost decoratively, a collection of smooth river stones. Once, memorably, a perfectly intact bird's nest, placed carefully on the doorstep. There was no way to prove these came from the bear, but Sarah knew. It was a continuation of the conversation that had begun that night, a wild thank you that needed no words. As autumn turned to winter, the bears would prepare for hibernation. Dr. Sarah knew this would be the last she would see of them for many months. On one of the last warm days of fall, she saw them one final time at the forest edge. The mother bear stood tall, her cub beside her, now almost as large as a full-grown dog. They were healthy, strong, ready for the winter ahead. Dr. Sarah stepped outside the clinic and raised her hand in a wave. The bear didn't wave back, of course, but she stood there for a long moment acknowledging the goodbye. Then they turned and disappeared into the forest that was their home, carrying with them a story that would become legend. The impact of this event rippled outward in unexpected ways. Other veterinarians began reporting similar, if less dramatic, encounters with wild animals seeking help. It sparked a new field of study into animal intelligence and problem-solving abilities. Wildlife rehabilitation centers began rethinking their approaches to treating and releasing injured animals. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the people who lived in that small mountain community. They began to see the forest differently, to understand that it was full of intelligence and emotion that they had never recognized before. They became more protective of the wild spaces, more respectful of the creatures that lived there. The story of the bear, who carried her injured cub 50 miles to find help, became a reminder that the natural world was far more complex and wonderful than most people imagined. Ethan's photographs from that journey would eventually be compiled into a book, with all proceeds going to wildlife conservation efforts. The images told the story without words, showing the bear's determination, the trust she placed in humans, the successful healing of her cub. But the most powerful image was the last one he took on that final autumn day. It showed the two bears at the forest edge, silhouettes against the golden light of sunset, walking away into their world. It was an image of wild freedom, but also of connection, a reminder that sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, different worlds can touch and help each other. Dr. Sarah continued her practice, treating the domestic animals of the community, but she was changed by the experience. She would often find herself looking toward the forest, wondering about the bears, hoping they were well. She kept the examination room exactly as it had been that night, the space where impossible trust had been given and honored. Sometimes, when treating a particularly difficult case, she would remember the mother bear's eyes, the determination in them, the refusal to give up. It gave her strength, reminded her why she had become a veterinarian in the first place. Not just to heal animals, but to be part of the deeper connection between all living things, to honor the trust that animals place in humans when they are at their most vulnerable. Tom, too, was changed. He went back to school, studying wildlife biology, inspired by what he had witnessed. He would eventually become one of the leading researchers in animal intelligence, always crediting that night with the bears as the moment that shaped his career. He never forgot the feeling of watching the mother bear trust them with her cub, the weight of responsibility that came with that trust. It informed all his future work, reminding him that animals were not just subjects to be studied, but individuals with their own intelligence, emotions, and capacity for remarkable behavior. The story spread quietly through the scientific community, then more broadly, but always with respect for the bear's privacy. The exact location was never revealed, the clinic never identified publicly. It became one of those stories that people weren't quite sure whether to believe, too remarkable to be true, yet too well documented to be dismissed. Wildlife biologists would debate it at conferences. Philosophers would use it in discussions about animal consciousness, and ethicists would cite it in arguments about our responsibilities to wild animals. But for those who had been there, it was simpler than all that. It was a story about love, about a mother's determination to save her child, and about the possibility of understanding and compassion across the boundaries of species. As winter arrived and snow began to fall in the mountains, "Doctor?" Sarah would sometimes stand at the window of her clinic, looking out at the white-covered forest. Somewhere in there, in a den carefully prepared and insulated, the mother bear and her cub were sleeping through the cold months. The cub's leg was fully healed, strong and straight. When spring came, they would emerge, and the cub would run and climb and play without any limitation, without any sign of the injury that had almost cost its life. That healing had required an impossible journey, an unprecedented trust, and a collaboration between wild and domestic that challenged everything we thought we knew. But it had happened. The evidence was there in Ethan's photograph. In the medical records, Dr. Sarah had carefully maintained in the memories of those who had witnessed it. The story took on a life of its own in the local community. Children would draw pictures of the bear carrying her cub. Adults would tell the story around campfires, each telling adding small embellishments but always respecting the core truth of it. It became part of the local identity, a source of pride that their small mountain town had been the site of such a remarkable event. The veterinary clinic became an unofficial landmark, though tourists who came looking for it were gently redirected, the community protective of both the bears and Dr. Sarah's privacy. The story belonged to the mountains, to the forest, and to the quiet understanding that sometimes extraordinary things happen when compassion overcomes fear. Years would pass, and occasionally hikers would report seeing a large female bear with distinctive scars on her shoulders, scars that might have come from carrying a heavy burden for a long distance. Sometimes she would be alone, sometimes with new cubs, teaching them the ways of the forest. But there were also reports, never confirmed but persistent, of this bear helping other injured animals. A fox with a wounded leg found carried to a stream where the cold water would reduce swelling. A fawn separated from its mother gently guided back to the deer trails. These stories might have been fantasy, projection of human hopes onto wild animal behavior. Or they might have been true, evidence that the bear had learned something from her experience, had understood that help was possible, that kindness could cross species boundaries. Dr. Sarah never saw her special patient again after that last autumn day, but she didn't need to. The impact of that encounter lasted her entire career and beyond. She would eventually retire, passing her practice to a younger veterinarian, but not before sharing the full story and impressing upon them the importance of being open to the impossible. Because if a wild bear could trust a human with her injured cub, if that trust could be honored and rewarded with healing, then what other bridges might be built between the human and natural worlds? What other impossible connections might be waiting to be discovered? The examination room, where it had all happened, became something of a shrine, kept exactly as it was, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary places. Ethan continued his career as a wildlife photographer, but he was more selective about what he photographed and how he shared his work. The bear had taught him that some moments were too precious to be commodified, that the trust of wild animals was a gift that should never be exploited. He would return to those mountains often, always hoping for another glimpse of the bears, but understanding that their story was complete. They had shown him and the world something remarkable, and now they deserved to live their lives in peace, wild and free. His photographs from that journey became his most famous work, not because of their technical excellence, though they were stunning, but because they captured something ineffable about the possibility of connection across difference. The scientific community continued to study and debate the event. Papers were written about animal intelligence, about learned behavior versus instinct, about the capacity for abstract thinking in non-human species. The bear's journey raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. How had she known that the building with the strange smells and human presence was a place of healing? Had she observed other animals being brought there and leaving healed? Was it learned behavior passed down through generations of bears in that area? Or was it something more mysterious, a kind of intelligence that we were only beginning to understand? The debates would continue for years, but they all agreed on one point. What had happened was extraordinary and challenged our understanding of the natural world. The broader impact was perhaps even more significant than the scientific discussions. The story inspired new approaches to wildlife rehabilitation, with facilities designing spaces that allowed wild animals to seek help while maintaining their autonomy. It influenced policy discussions about human-wildlife interaction, suggesting that coexistence might be more possible than previously thought if approached with respect and understanding. Conservation efforts in the area received increased support, with people understanding that they were protecting not just habitat but intelligent, emotional beings capable of remarkable behavior. The forest where the bears lived became an unofficial sanctuary, protected not by law but by community consensus that this place was special and should remain undisturbed. As the years passed, the story took on an almost mythical quality, but those who had been there knew it was real. Dr. Sarah, in her retirement, would sometimes give talks at veterinary schools, sharing not just the facts of what had happened but the deeper lesson it carried. That healing was not just about medical intervention, but about trust, respect, and the willingness to see beyond our assumptions about what animals were capable of. She would show Ethan's photographs, tell the story of that incredible night, and watch as young veterinary students' eyes widened with wonder and possibility. Some would be skeptical, but many would be inspired, understanding that their chosen profession might offer opportunities for connection and service beyond what they had imagined. Tom, now doctor. Tom became a leading voice in animal cognition research. His studies, always informed by that night with the bears, pushed the boundaries of what science understood about animal intelligence. He developed new methodologies for studying wild animal behavior that prioritized observation over intervention, respect over control. His work helped establish new ethical guidelines for wildlife research, guidelines that recognized animals as individuals with their own agency rather than merely subjects for study. He would often credit the mother bear as his first and most important teacher in understanding that intelligence and emotion in animals were not anthropomorphism, but recognition of shared qualities across species. The community around the clinic changed too. They became known for their respectful relationship with wildlife, for understanding that they shared the mountains with creatures that deserved consideration and protection. Children grew up with the story of the bear and her cub, learning from an early age that the forest was not just a resource or a playground, but a home to intelligent beings with their own lives and needs. This influenced how they approached development, how they managed tourism, how they balanced human needs with environmental protection. The town became a model for coexistence, showing that economic development and wildlife conservation didn't have to be in conflict if approached with wisdom and respect. On quiet nights, when the moon was full and the forest was silver with its light, people would sometimes report seeing a large bear standing at the forest edge, just watching the human world with what seemed like curiosity rather than fear. Whether it was the same bear or her descendants, no one could say for certain. But the sightings reinforced the sense that the boundary between wild and civilized was more permeable than most people thought. The connections made with respect and kindness could echo through generations. The bears had become part of the community's story, and the community had become part of the bears' story. Two narratives intertwined in a way that enriched both. The veterinary clinic installed a small, discreet plaque near the back door where the bears had entered that night. It simply read, "In this place, trust was given and honored across the boundaries of species. May we always be worthy of such trust." Dr. Sarah had insisted on the wording, wanting to capture not the drama of the event but its deeper meaning. Visitors who knew the story would sometimes touch the plaque, like a talisman, a reminder that extraordinary things were possible when fear gave way to compassion. The clinic became a place of pilgrimage for some, not in any religious sense, but as a site where something profound about the nature of life and connection had been revealed. As Dr. Sarah aged, she would often think about that night, about the weight of the bear cub in her hands, about the mother's eyes watching her work. She had been privileged to participate in something that most people would never experience, a moment of pure trust between species that usually lived in entirely separate worlds. It had shaped not just her career, but her understanding of what it meant to be alive in a world full of other conscious beings. She had learned that healing was not just a human skill, but a force that existed throughout nature, and that sometimes, if we were very lucky and very open, we could be part of that larger healing that connected all living things. The cub, grown now into an adult bear, possibly with cubs of its own, carried no visible sign of its early injury. The leg that had been broken healed so completely that there was no limp, no weakness. It was as if the injury had never happened, except for the knowledge it carried, the memory of humans who had helped when help was desperately needed. Whether this memory influenced its behavior, whether it passed on some understanding to its offspring, no one could say. But rangers and hikers in the area reported that bears there seemed less afraid of humans than in other places, not aggressive or demanding, but simply less likely to flee at the first sign of human presence. It was as if a treaty had been signed that night in the clinic, an understanding that mutual respect was possible. The story would be told and retold, each telling adding layers of meaning and interpretation. Some saw it as proof that animals were more intelligent than science gave them credit for. Others saw it as evidence of some deeper connection between all living things, a kind of consciousness that transcended individual species. Still, others saw it simply as a beautiful anomaly, a once-in-a-lifetime event that couldn't be explained or replicated, but could be celebrated for its uniqueness. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the bear's trust and determination, it was simpler and more profound than any of these interpretations. It was a reminder that love, the fierce, protective love of a parent for a child, was perhaps the most powerful force in nature, capable of overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles. The scientific papers would continue to be written, the debates would continue in academic conferences, but the real legacy of the event was in how it changed individual lives. Every veterinarian who heard the story approached their next wild animal patient with a little more respect, a little more openness to the possibility of communication and trust. Every wildlife photographer thought twice before pursuing that perfect shot if it meant disturbing an animal's natural behavior. Every hiker in those mountains walked with a greater sense of sharing the space rather than owning it. The ripples spread outward, touching lives in ways that couldn't be measured or documented, but were nonetheless real. On the anniversary of that first night, Dr. Sarah would always spend some time at the clinic, even after retirement. She would stand in the examination room where it had all happened, remembering the weight of responsibility and privilege she had felt. Sometimes, if the evening was clear, she would see bears at the forest edge, though whether they were the same bears or others she couldn't tell. But their presence felt like a continuation of the story, a reminder that the connection made that night hadn't been a one-time event, but the beginning of a new understanding. The forest and the clinic, the wild and the domestic, had touched and found that the boundary between them was not a wall but a membrane, permeable to trust and compassion. The mother bear's journey, 50 miles through difficult terrain, carrying her injured cub, became a symbol of determination and hope. Athletes would invoke it during difficult training. Parents dealing with sick children would remember it and find strength. It became a story that belonged not just to that mountain community, but to anyone who needed reminding that love could motivate seemingly impossible acts of courage and endurance. The image of the bear, standing upright, cradling her cub, walking with purpose toward an uncertain but necessary goal, became an icon of parental devotion that transcended species boundaries. It reminded people that the drive to protect and save one's offspring was perhaps the most universal force in nature, shared across all forms of life. As technology advanced and cameras became more sophisticated, there would be other documented cases of wild animals seeking human help, but none quite captured the imagination like the story of the bear and her cub. Perhaps it was the distance she traveled, the deliberate choice to trust ancient enemies, or the perfect timing of her return for cast removal. Or perhaps it was simply that the story came at a time when people needed reminding that the natural world was full of intelligence and emotion that deserved respect and protection. Whatever the reason, the story endured, passed down through generations, each telling adding new meaning while preserving the essential truth of what had happened. Dr. Sarah lived to be 93, sharp and active until the end. In her final days, she would tell anyone who would listen about the night a wild bear brought her injured cub to her clinic. Some thought it was the wandering of an aging mind, but those who knew her understood she was sharing the most important experience of her life. She died peacefully in her sleep, and at her memorial service, Tom shared the full story with all who attended, showing Ethan's photographs, reading from the scientific papers they had published. There wasn't a dry eye in the congregation, not because of sadness, but because of the beauty of a life that had been touched by such an extraordinary event and had honored that touch with a lifetime of compassionate service. After the service, someone reported seeing a bear at the cemetery, standing at a respectful distance, watching as doctor. Sarah was laid to rest. It was probably coincidence, a random sighting of a random bear. But those who knew the story wondered if perhaps the forest itself was paying its respects to a human who had understood that healing knows no boundaries, that trust can bridge any gap, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when we're open to the impossible. The bear didn't stay long, disappearing back into the forest as quietly as it had appeared, but its presence felt like a closing of a circle, a final acknowledgement of a connection that had changed lives across species boundaries. The examination room at the clinic was eventually turned into a small museum, displaying Ethan's photographs, Doctor. Sarah's notes from that night, the cast that had been removed from the cub's leg. Veterinary students would visit, learning not just about the medical aspects of treating wildlife, but about the broader implications of the event. They would stand in the space where it had happened, trying to imagine the scene, the massive bear watching as doctor. Sarah worked on her cub. Many would leave inspired, understanding that their chosen profession might offer opportunities for connection and service beyond what they had imagined. The room became a classroom for teaching about trust, respect, and the possibility of communication across difference. Ethan, now in his 70s, still returned to those mountains every year. He no longer carried heavy camera equipment, content instead to sit quietly in the forest, watching and remembering. Sometimes he would see bears, and he would wonder if they carried any genetic memory of that night, any inherited understanding that humans could be trusted in desperate circumstances. He had spent his life documenting wildlife, but nothing had ever matched the profound impact of following that mother bear on her impossible journey. His photographs from that event remained his most important work, not because of their artistic merit, but because they documented a moment when the impossible became possible, when love transcended fear, when trust bridged the gap between wild and civilized. The story would continue to be told, studied, and debated. Scientists would propose theories, philosophers would extract meanings, and storytellers would add their own interpretations. But at its heart, it remained a simple story. A mother bear loved her cub enough to attempt the impossible, and humans were kind enough to help. In a world often divided by differences, it stood as a reminder that compassion could cross any boundary, that intelligence and emotion existed in forms we were only beginning to understand, and that sometimes, if we were very lucky and very open, we could be part of something larger than ourselves. The bear had carried her cub 50 miles through dense forest to find help, but in doing so, she had carried all of us a little closer to understanding our place in the larger community of life. The forest remained, protected now by both law and love. The trails where the bear had walked became paths of pilgrimage for those who knew the story. People would walk quietly, respectfully, understanding that they were in a place where something sacred had happened. Not sacred in any religious sense, but sacred in the way that all moments of perfect trust and compassion are sacred. The trees that had witnessed the bear's journey stood as silent testimony to what had occurred, their rings adding new growth each year, incorporating the story into their very structure. In 100 years, when these trees were old and massive, they would still carry within them the memory of that time, encoded in their wood, part of the forest's permanent record. And somewhere in that forest, descendants of the bear and her cub continued their lives wild and free. They hunted and foraged, raised their young, and lived according to the ancient patterns of their kind. But perhaps, in moments of trouble or uncertainty, they remembered or inherited some understanding that the boundary between their world and the human world was not absolute, that in extreme circumstances, help might be found in unexpected places. This knowledge, if it existed, would be passed down not in words but in behavior, in the subtle ways that mothers teach their cubs about the world. And perhaps, someday, another desperate parent would make another impossible journey, trusting in the possibility of compassion across difference. The legacy of that night lived on in countless ways, some visible, some hidden. Every act of kindness toward animals, every moment of recognition that we share this world with other intelligent beings, every decision to protect rather than destroy wild spaces, carried an echo of the bear's trust and doctor. Sarah's response. The story became part of humanity's larger narrative about our relationship with nature, a hopeful note in an often discordant symphony. It suggested that we might be capable of being better neighbors to the wild creatures with whom we share the planet, that understanding and respect were possible if we approached with open hearts and minds. As the years turned to decades, the story took on the quality of legend, but the evidence remained. Photographs, medical records, scientific papers, and the testimonies of those who had been there. It became a case study in veterinary schools, a topic of discussion in philosophy classes, a bedtime story told to children around the world. Each telling might change small details, but the core remained constant. Love motivated impossible courage, trust was given and honored, and healing happened across the boundaries that usually separate species. It was a story that made people cry, not from sadness, but from a kind of joy that came from recognizing something fundamentally good about the possibilities of existence. The small mountain town prospered in quiet ways, becoming known as a place where the relationship between human and natural worlds was approached with unusual wisdom. Tourism came, but it was a different kind of tourism, attracting people who wanted to walk quietly in the forest, who understood that they were visiting a place where something remarkable had happened. The local economy adapted, creating opportunities that celebrated rather than exploited the natural environment. The veterinary clinic became a teaching center, hosting workshops on wildlife medicine and human-wildlife coexistence. The community understood that they had been given a gift, had been chosen to witness something extraordinary, and they took their responsibility as stewards of that story seriously. Dr. Sarah's successor at the clinic, a young veterinarian named Doctor. Marcus had been drawn to the position specifically because of the story. He had heard it in veterinary school and hadn't quite believed it until he saw the evidence, talked to the witnesses, stood in the examination room where it had happened. He approached his work with a sense of possibility, always remembering that the animals he treated, domestic or wild, were individuals with their own intelligence, emotions, and capacity for trust. He kept the back door of the clinic unlocked during certain hours, just in case another desperate parent needed help. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless, but it felt important to maintain that openness to the impossible. One spring morning, almost 20 years after the original event, Marcus arrived at the clinic to find muddy paw prints leading to the back door. They were bear prints, but smaller than an adult's, perhaps a yearling or young adult. Beside the door was a small pile of objects, several perfect pine cones, a smooth river stone, and remarkably, a small piece of what looked like old plaster, weathered and worn, but unmistakably from a cast. Dr. Marcus stood there for a long moment, looking at these offerings, understanding that the story was not over, might never be over. The connection made that night decades ago continued to ripple through time, touching new generations, creating new possibilities for understanding and cooperation between species. He carefully collected the gifts, placing them in the museum room beside the other artifacts from that night. Then he went about his day, treating the domestic animals that were brought to him, but with a heightened awareness that at any moment the impossible might walk through his door again. This was the true legacy of the bear's journey. Not just the single event, but the openness it created, the readiness to recognize and respond to extraordinary circumstances with compassion and skill. Every veterinarian who worked at that clinic understood that they were part of something larger than routine animal medicine. They were keepers of a trust, guardians of a possibility, ready to honor the bridge between worlds if it presented itself again. The story spread through indigenous communities in the area as well, resonating with traditional beliefs about the intelligence and spirit of animals. Elders nodded knowingly when they heard it, saying it confirmed what they had always known, that the boundaries between human and animal were constructs of modern thinking, that in the deeper reality, all beings were related, all capable of communication and mutual aid. They incorporated the story into their own narratives, adding layers of meaning from their cultural perspective. The bear became not just a desperate mother, but a teacher, showing humans what they had forgotten about the natural world. The story became a bridge not just between species, but between different ways of understanding the world.